Have you ever wanted to travel to Cuba? It's a tropical island. It's located about 485 miles off the coast of Florida. But up until a couple years ago, it was illegal for American citizens to go there. And this is due in large part to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis took place over 13 days in October of 1962. And the Cuban Missile Crisis involved three countries. It involved the United States of America, it involved the island nation of Cuba, and it involved the former Soviet Union. Now, all three of these countries had issues. America had issues with two of them, and the other two were friends, but not friends with America. Post-World War II America was very, very paranoid, sort of like a neighbor that you might have that's always looking out their window. And the Cuban Missile Crisis did take place during the Cold War era. So communism was a big concern. And although America and Russia had been allies during World War II, after that they were pretty much frenemies. And they were communists. So America already had its weird issues with the USSR. And now Cuba, where they get their sugar from, has a communist leader, Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro came in and overthrew the previous pro-American government. And Castro was a declared communist. He had Marxist beliefs. And America didn't like that. So America decided that they were going to go ahead and go in and overthrow the Castro government. And they used a military tactic known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was also a military failure. Not only did America fail to overthrow the government in Cuba, but they also ended up getting about 1,400 soldiers detained on Cuban soil. The U.S. government decided to start racking up sanctions against Cuba. And they also tried to plan another psychological and physical attack called Operation Mongoose, which didn't work either. So inevitably, America just ends up putting an embargo against Cuba, which causes Cuba to take a huge economic hit. They're losing all their money because America pretty much bought all their sugar. Now, the USSR was watching all of this happen, and since Castro was a communist, their leader, Nikita Khrushchev, says to Cuba that they will buy the sugar and that they will give them money. All Cuba has to do is just let the USSR put some leftover missiles and nuclear, missiles and arms from World War II. And Castro says that that's fine. Now, Kennedy was aware that Khrushchev was trying to place the arms there. And Khrushchev didn't know that Kennedy knew because he wanted to place them there and then present America with a fait accompli, which is basically when you say, hey, this is going to happen because I have all these things. So Kennedy tried to warn Khrushchev. Khrushchev said, whatever, I'm just going to do what I want. And the missiles were there. And on October 16th, 1962, at 8:45 a.m., President Kennedy was informed that there were medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. Now, medium-range ballistic missiles have the possibility of traveling up to 1,000 miles. So Cuba's only 485 miles away. So those missiles certainly have the possibility of hitting American soil and doing damage. So all of a sudden, President Kennedy has to figure out a way to stop a nuclear disaster from happening. So he gets together a group of guys called XCOM to come up with ideas with him to try to stop this nuclear disaster. And XCOM comes up with three options. They say that we can just bomb them, we can do a military strike against the missiles, or we can set up a blockade. And President Kennedy, in the sense of diplomacy, decided to just go ahead and do the blockade. But while this is happening, Castro's over there telling Khrushchev, he's like, hey, if the U.S. comes anywhere near Cuba, I want you to go ahead and launch the missiles. So days 2 through 11 of this Cuban Missile Crisis is basically President Kennedy trying to reason with both of the countries to stop a nuclear disaster from happening, and at the same time trying to keep everybody in America calm. There's a lot of information that happened on those days, and due to time constraints, I can't go over all of them. But it ended with a gentleman's agreement on October 28th of 1962. And the agreement was for the U.S. to withdraw all of their missiles from Turkey, because Khrushchev wanted them out of there. And in return, Khrushchev would pull all of his missiles out of Cuba. And they also had an agreement that America had to promise not to ever attack Cuba again. So There is a lot more to the story. I definitely recommend giving it a Google, Cuban Missile Crisis, because it's actually really cool. But you should definitely never underestimate the little guy in any situation, because that tiny island that's only 485 miles away almost caused a nuclear disaster.